Here's what I made. Hi, I'm Kent. I've been doing ceramics for about 3.5 years now, but I taught myself during the pandemic. At the beginning of the year, I decided I would go ahead and take my first ceramics class ever. A few weeks ago, I gave an update on what I've been up to, and the class just finished, so I figured I'd walk through everything. Here are all the pots that I made. These over here I have talked about before, but I'll cover them briefly. The tiles here are new, as well as this form, and then I have a few wheel thrown things as well. The class itself was basically 10 weeks. It was a little bit longer, but there were some holidays in there, and we met twice a week for a couple of hours. The class basically focused on hand building things, and if you had some extra time, you could go and try out the wheel. Overall, the class consisted of basically 4 big projects. So the previous video I covered the first 2 projects. These are the next 2 projects, and this was all bonus time. So to start, we did a pinch pot, and this was basically go from start to finish very quickly. Don't worry too much about the form. Basically, the instructor was trying to give us a sense of what it meant to go from clay to a finished piece, all the way through glazing. The clay we used was the same clay throughout, although this clay is a little bit different. It's a highly grogged clay, so it works pretty well with hand building and fires to cone 6. So that was my first pinch pot and tried out this glaze. The next project was to do another pinch pot, and I made 2. That was at least 5 inches in diameter. This one wound up shrinking a little bit, so it was a bonus pot, and this is the one that I wound up getting graded. I used the same glaze on these, and I really like these glazes. I went ahead and found the recipes, so at some point I'm going to mix up a batch of these. One of the fun things about doing the pinch pots, instead of doing the slip casting I normally do, is that it was really easy to explore different forms. The form quality isn't quite where I would like it, but it gives me a lot of ideas. One of the things I've been thinking about with Shapecast is basically how do I teach myself different forms. I will go and design things and I'll print out some drafts, but it doesn't quite seem the same. It may be that I just need to complement my slip casting with something else so I can get a better form of what the finished ceramic pieces are like. And it's fun to play with new glazes as well. Next up was another pinch pot. This one basically took 2 pots and then put them together, and we put a coil around them so we captured an air pocket. It was really weird holding a large piece of clay with air in it, like the density was just wrong. It was kind of fun, but weird. That's how both of these started. I then manipulated them, cut a hole in the top, punched a hole in the bottom so it could be a planter. This one was raku fired. So it's basically fired to somewhere around cone 06, basically a bisque temperature, so it is not fully vitrified. This glaze was fun, and then I made a second one, again, kind of as a backup. This one I was playing around with different surface texture, so it's got a stain in the surface and a very similar form. This one was fired to cone 6, so it's fully vitrified. Both of these are very chunky pots. I think that's because the bisque isn't as strong. He instructed us to make them more chunky. So that's a quick recap. Next up were these 2 projects. So there were tiles and then this piece here. The tiles were exploring a bunch of different surface finishes, and for this one, he basically wanted us to look at something historical and reference that, and then to make it tall. In particular, he wanted something taller than wider. And since this one barely fits in frame, I think it satisfies that requirement. We actually made 4 tiles. One of them they never glaze fired. I think it got pushed off to the side. I think we found it eventually, but it didn't make it in time for the class to finish. And we played with basically 4 different surface finishes. So this one here is maybe the simplest. The idea was to make a carving when it was leather hard, to go ahead and biscuit, and then apply stains. They had a bunch of different stains we used. This one I used a copper stain, so it went nice and green. I really like perspective art, so I basically carved angles down like this and then more vertical. And so the idea is that it will look different depending upon the angle you look at it. So from this side, it's a little bit more green. And then from this side, a little less so because it's shadowed. This one's kind of rough. I was just playing around with this idea. It was okay, but I'm not sure it was my favorite. Next, we did some sgraffito, and that's this one. So again, we took it to leather hard, and then we applied a layer of colored slip over the top. That then went bone dry. We then carved patterns into it. So for this one, I actually printed out a paper template that I liked. It had these kind of it had a triangle pattern here, and then I went ahead and carved back some of the clay, both the lines between the triangles as well as some open areas. I actually carved the different open areas in different directions, and you can kind of see that a little bit through the clear glaze on top. Since this clay is very heavily grogged, it wound up with these scratch marks in it. You can kind of see them through the surface. It's kind of fun. And then last is this tile here. This is Mishima. So again, at leather hard, you will go ahead and carve down into it, and then you take the slip and gradually build it back up. At one point, basically the whole surface was covered with slip, and then once it's dry again, you can then scrape back the excess slip on top, leaving what's only left in the valleys. So this one's nice and colorful. It's got this kind of starburst look to it. It's got a clear glaze on top. So the colors here are actually in the clay body, the slip that we put on. And this one was fun. This is actually a pattern I would draw as a kid, so kind of went back to that. The last tile I don't have was actually a shellac trap. So very similarly, we took a tile, we let it get leather hard, we then put slip over the top. It then went bone dry. At that point, we used shellac to put a pattern on top, and the shellac basically will firm up and act as a resist, so you can then sponge away on the top of the tile. It'll remove the areas where there isn't shellac, and the shellac will stay. So those are the tiles. Those were fun. I guess the other thing was that these used a slab roller, and I'd never used a slab roller before. I can definitely see the appeal of a slab roller. It was really nice and easy to get very uniform pieces of clay out of that. And then finally is this piece here, which barely fits in frame. So this one, I basically went online and found a piece at the British National Museum that was kind of bottle shaped, and that was my inspiration. For this one, we did plan drawings. So we did a small scale drawing and then did the math to basically do measurements to try and get it up to scale. And then at basically different intervals, we checked it to make sure that it was the right width. This one was coil built. So the bottom, we threw out a slab and then took coils of clay and went around and adhered them together, squishing them along the way, all the way up. This form came together relatively quickly, basically just in a few classes. Some other people in the class took forever, it seemed. So I kind of threw this together, and then I spent all my time refining it. I could tell that it wasn't symmetrical, and the shoulder wasn't right, and a bunch of other things. So I went back and forth a lot of time, adding clay, subtracting clay, until I got this final form here. It's definitely still hand-built. There's some kind of unevenness to it, but I suspect no one would notice. And then the glazing, I basically did the same glaze as I did on my pinch pots here. I really liked this glaze. I put it all in the opposite order, though. I don't know that it made much difference. And the color profiles are very similar. So glazed all the way down to here, and then did the cover glaze up to there. And then, again, the cover glaze is on the inside. And then for a foot, I just did a very simple foot. Just kind of carved it off and then put in my stamp as well. There's a few small defects. I had a little bit of crawling here, but not too bad. I don't think you'd notice. And there were actually some defects in the clay body itself once it was bisqued. I had a few cracks. I think that was from basically applying clay, and I didn't get it slipped and scored enough when I put it on. But the glaze basically hides all those. This may be one of them. But that was fun. I have never made anything this big, except for once. With slip casting, I very much am limited by my molds, and so just having a mold big enough to make something like this would be really tricky. I did once try and make a giant hand-built pot that I coil built to act as a large planter, and I didn't do a very good job. I didn't get the coils adhered properly, and it wound up cracking. I have a video on that if you're curious. Since this one worked, I think I have a better shot at it. I think there's a few key differences. One is just some technique around coil building. I have a better idea of how that works now and how to compress it together. Probably the clay matters a little bit as well. I think this highly grogged clay helps. I finished up the tiles and my large form relatively quickly, and so basically the rest of the time was bonus time where we could go and sit on the wheels. He gave us a quick demo in one class, and then the rest of it was basically go and figure it out on your own. Here's the first piece that made it all the way. I threw many pieces. Of course, most of them didn't make it past being just wet clay, and then we threw it back in the reclaim so it could be recycled. This clay is actually all reclaimed clay, so it's kind of a random mix of different things. So this one I'll talk about in a second. It has some colors in it. They have a really large trash can for reclaimed clay that people can just throw in. They then have a mixer that mixes it all up, and you can add some extra raw ingredients to it to get the consistency right. And then they have a pug mill to go ahead and finish mixing and then extrude it. So basically this started off, you go over to the pug mill and you pull out however much clay you want. It's kind of a sausage that big, you cut it off, you wedge it a little bit, throw it on the wheel, and then go at it. I've realized that large hand and small forms don't really go well together, so I made something larger to start with. I made a few pieces. This was the only one that I was able to actually get all the way through and trimmed. I tried trimming a few others and they died along the way, so they went back into reclaim. This one's a little chunky. You can't feel the weight, but the bottom here is thicker than it needs to be. I was worried that I'd punch through. I think getting the dryness right for trimming is really tricky, and since we were only in class, twice a week, that made it even more challenging. Carved a little bit of a ring here, and it was a little bit off center, but good enough. And this glaze was, I thought, really simple, but if you look really closely, there's some really cool crystalline effects in it. There we go up close. So there's all these tiny little microcrystals that grew in the bottom. So that was kind of a fun surprise. And then it broke over towards the edges. So we have this nice kind of variegated effect. I think here you can see it better on the rim. And there's a couple of small pinholes, but I think for my first thrown pot, I'll call that a win. And then I had several more classes to try a bunch more, and I managed to do these three. I forget exactly which order they were in. I think maybe this one was first. And then I did these two, and of course I threw a bunch more than this, and several of them died to trimming as well, so these are the few that made it all the way through. So this one here, I have kind of a flared out foot. Somewhat like this one, I glazed down a little bit farther. I didn't get the glaze on the belly exactly right, but again, okay. And it's reasonably symmetrical. I think I picked this one up when it was too wet, and it definitely deformed. And then this one has a fun crackle effect in it. So this is a Celadon glaze. So if you look really closely, there's a really tiny little crackling effect. And you can also see where the glaze got thicker in the ring at the bottom from when I was throwing. And then there's some of the specks that came through that are in the reclaimed clay. So I like this form, it was fun. And the trimming I did much better on this one. It's much more uniform. This one here, someone had some really dark iron clay that had wound up in the reclaim, and I didn't wedge it all that well, so it wound up being this kind of marbled effect. I know you can do this intentionally, but this was just kind of random. This one I trimmed the foot a little bit better. And it's got a pretty good weight. I think I could have trimmed a little bit deeper. And this is just glazed in clear since I figured the clay looked pretty cool. And this one is their copper red glaze. It's got this really interesting kind of variegated effect. This one I try to collar in, and so the top is narrower than the outside. And I think I did the best job on the foot on this one. Nice and even. Having never thrown before this class, that was fun. I'm sure I have more to go in terms of practicing technique, but I could see how people really get into it. So that was a lot of fun. It was fun going to a studio and being in a shared studio space and having lots of people around me. Seeing everyone else's ideas was fun. You guys are great, but you guys really aren't in person, so it was definitely a different experience. Having an instructor around is nice, and they could provide supervision. I didn't really need much of that, but just hearing them explain things to other students was kind of fun. I think the other thing that was a little bit of an unexpected benefit was basically the projects themselves. These are things that I would not have made by myself, and so basically given the challenge of, go make some tiles and do some surface decorations, or make a hollow form, make something tall and narrow. I think these are actually interesting to basically explore my design sense. It's one of the things I think I have done little with, because of slip casting you have a relatively high investment into your forms. I think with shape cast I am lowering that, but I think there's still more to do. I went ahead and signed up for another class, so I'll probably be spending more time in there as well, and that means shape cast development will probably still be a little bit slow, but this has been really fun, so I've enjoyed it. And hopefully a bit of a change for you guys watching as well, and you can see some other ideas kind of come through. I definitely have already had some inspiration for some new things I want to try. And just as a teaser, one of them is this. However, it may be a few months before I get into explaining what this is. So if you really want to figure this out, subscribe, and eventually I'll cover it in more detail. And with that, let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thanks.